ближе, потому что их как бы они рассеяны по всему залу, как бы еще кто-то такой завтракает, я не знаю, спит и так далее. Те, кто есть, чтобы они хотя бы сели, чтобы было ощущение. А? Нет, ты же модератор.
Здесь... О, прекрасно. Good morning. Доброе утро. If anybody wants to move on up, so we can see you better and you can hear us better, please feel free to do so. Looks like we've got plenty of space while folks are finishing up their breakfast. But we'll start so that we can try to stay a bit on schedule. My name is Marina Yudbarovsky. I'm the Director of Strategy and Operations for Genesis Philanthropy Group. And it's my sincere pleasure to start off the second day of this conference with a panel focused on research in the fields of xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and racism. Unfortunately, as we all know all too well, these days this topic is as timely as ever, and societies all over the world are struggling with the persistence of each of these phenomena. It's often said that anti-Semitism is one of the oldest forms of xenophobia, and while it's very old, it's unfortunately not yet gone. And until last Saturday, one of the largest diaspora community in the world thought of violent anti-Semitism as a matter of historical significance and something of a concern in other communities. But today, this for Americans is now a day-to-day reality, and they've joined the world with that, unfortunately. Research is a powerful tool in the fight against these kinds of realities. It gives us an opportunity to look at the scale, to see the dynamics of these forces and the drivers of these actions and feelings in various environments. We've already had a lot of valuable conversations at this conference around expanding our understanding of how these scourges affect various aspects of human endeavor. And I'm sure you're all aware of the study that's been released in concert with this conference done by the Levada Center about anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and racism in Russia. Today, at this panel, we have a unique opportunity to hear from the top experts, researchers, and thought leaders from around the world, to get a sort of state of the union regarding research in these areas. What has been done, what is being done, and what still needs to be done. They may not say so themselves, but we have on stage the foremost experts globally in the field of social research in the Jewish community. Surprisingly, while each of these gentlemen presents in conferences all over the world, they've never shared a stage, as far as we know. And we're thrilled at GPG to be able to make this discussion possible. So, without further ado, please welcome for our first panelist, Professor Alexei Levinson. Professor Levinson is the head of the Department of Social and Cultural Research at the Levada Center in Russia, which produced the 2018 study examining xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism in Russia, as well as many, many others. Thank you.
Можно презентацию? Нет, это не моя. Микрофон? Да, пожалуйста, но.
Alexei, the presentation?
Да, но вот хочу видеть, да, вот это моя презентация, значит, время пошло. Я докладываю работу, которая находится в контексте исследований, проводимых Левада-центром по проблемам отношения к евреям. Стало быть, тема антисемитизма включает в себя и включается в эту тематику. И мы проводили как так называемые количественные исследования, то есть опросы, и о них рассказывал Лев Гудков, директор Левада-центра, вчера. Я хотел бы сосредоточиться на тех исследований, которые называются качественные, это интервью и фокус-группы или групповые дискуссии. Проводились лично мной и моими коллегами, в том числе присутствующими здесь. Вот в тех городах, которые там обозначены, мы беседовали с людьми, представляющими, ну, главные, как нам казалось, такие силы, участвующие в неком, так сказать, еврейском процессе в России. То есть, собственно, еврейское население с разной степенью вовлеченное в так называемую еврейскую жизнь, и тех, кто являлись их, так сказать, партнерами или образовывали контекст. Это русские православные, русские не вовлеченные в православие, мусульмане в нескольких городах Российской Федерации, и они здесь называются именно мусульмане, а не этническое обозначение, потому что это всюду смешанные группы, что в Дагестане, что даже, ну, в общем, везде это не моноэтнические группы. Ну вот, значит, что показывали исследования, собственно, в еврейской среде. Это разного рода высказывания, которые, их можно набрать было гораздо больше, которые говорят о том, что антисемитизма евреи не чувствуют. Они, ну не то чтобы они специально отрицают его существование, они скорее о нем в общем, им не приходится о нем говорить. Если их спрашивают, то вот они реагируют в общем словами о том, что его нет. Я хотел бы только здесь подчеркнуть, что когда в России, ну, такие обычные граждане вот, с еврейской идентичностью говорят, что антисемитизма нет, это значит, что нет его, ну, скажем так, грубых проявлений, которые задевали бы их безопасность или наносили бы прямые оскорбления и так далее. О более, так сказать, тонких видах антисемитизма, о которых мы потом спрашивали в ходе исследования количественного, здесь речь не шла. Вот такого антисемитизма, так сказать, прямого и грубого не отмечают. При этом, если, значит, провести исследование в среде русской, или вот, которая у нас тут названа мусульманской, то, если вы посмотрите, то вполне можно заметить, что, так сказать, негативное отношение к евреям вполне присутствует. Ну, а также присутствуют вещи, которые здесь не отразились, разнообразные там шуточки, анекдоты, высказывания, ну, разного рода паремии, которые, в общем, квалифицировать иначе, как антисемитские, кажется, нельзя. Поэтому, да, я только вот в перечислении этого, кроме таких заурядных определений, что евреи жадные, там, скупые, я бы обратил большое внимание на строчку «непатриотичные». Я потом скажу, почему это очень важно. Значит, перед нами в итоге встает дилемма, и она на прошлом вот конгрессе, она вполне, так сказать, живо обсуждалась. Ну так антисемитизм есть в России или нет? И получается, что исследования не позволяют вроде бы дать ответ на этот вопрос. Да, он есть, и да, его нет. Можно подтвердить и ту, и другую точку зрения. Ну, какой выход предлагается, вот, собственно, мое сообщение, оно вот посвящается этому вопросу. Если разделить антисемитизм на два таких типа, ну, с условными названиями активный и пассивный, то мы увидим, что вполне существует этот вот так называемый пассивный и не проявляет себя сейчас активный. Но что такое пассивный антисемитизм? Это довольно интересное явление. Это разнообразные формы выражения негативного отношения к евреям, еврейскому, всему, что ассоциируется с евреями, которые циркулируют, функционируют внутри нееврейской среды, ну, в частности, русской. Функционируют там и не имеют выхода вовне. Люди, которые позволяют себе антисемитские шуточки, не будут их позволять в присутствии евреев. Люди, которые считают, что там мировое правительство, значит, оно вот еврейское, или даже российское правительство, что оно там насквозь еврейское, они это сейчас не будут говорить, так сказать, в собрании, где ну, евреи присутствуют или возможно еврейское присутствие. Вот та пунктирная черта, которая здесь изображена, она задана чем? Она задана ну, отчасти там приличиями, отчасти остатками каких-то там интернационализма или еще чего-то в этом роде. Самое главное, чем она задана позиции высшего руководства страны. В этом отдают себе отчет евреи, по крайней мере. Ну, вот здесь сказано про то, зачем, так сказать, существует этот антисемитизм вот внутренний, внутрироссийский или там внутри дагестанский антисемитизм. Он нужен этим этносам, он нужен этим социумам для решения неких внутренних задач. Но там не только антисемитизм, там есть и другие этнофобии, но я говорю сейчас об этой, которые тоже существуют в таком вот режиме. Ну, как, не знаю, там анекдоты про чукчи, в общем, до чукчи, видимо, не долетают. Но они нужны русской среде зачем-то там. Это, ну, так, это нередкая вещь. Вот активный антисемитизм, тот, которого нет, или, скажем так, пока нет, это тот антисемитизм, который направлен на или уничтожение евреев, еврейства еврейского, или нанесение ему возможного ущерба, возможно, большого, ну, или в такой изысканной форме, о которой вчера говорил Гозман, так сказать, причинение всякого рода там оскорблений и так далее, но без права, так сказать, уйти из-под этого влияния. Но это, я бы сказал, маргинальная форма. Итак, значит, вот у нас ситуация, при которой антисемитизма нет и при которой он возможен. Вот дело в том, что на сию минуту власть использует ну, политику, которая там толерантна по отношению к евреям, или, может быть, там многие говорят, что она там и просто юдофильская и так далее, но, по крайней мере, она посылает знаки обществу не антисемитского характера, ну, кроме неких исключений. И власть тоже не монолитна, но речь идет о верховной власти. Так вот, верховная власть пока ведет себя вот таким образом, потому что ну, дружба с евреями, как дружба с Израилем, как вот эти хорошие, так сказать, отношения к евреям, это ресурс, выгодный ресурс, и он сейчас используется. Понятно, что антисемитская политика, которая государственный антисемитизм, это тоже политика, там есть свои ресурсы, свои выгоды для власти, и многие, в том числе и евреи, вполне, так сказать, допускают, что власть от одного ресурса перейдет к другому. И дело даже здесь не в там, природной нелюбви там, россиян или кого-то еще к евреям, это, в общем, дело политическое. Я хотел бы закончить вот чем. Мы наблюдали или продолжаем наблюдать, ну, я бы сказал, такое окно благоприятной конъюнктуры для еврейства в России. Ну, не сегодня началась вот эта ситуация, при которой евреи чувствуют себя свободно. Она длится, ну, по меньшей мере, там, с начала, видимо, ельцинских времен, но где-то была еще инерция там прошлой поры. За это время произошло, ну, значительное возрождение так называемой еврейской жизни, и часть еврейства нашла себя там. ну, мы все знаем о, так сказать, еврейском возрождении общин и так далее. Эти люди, ну, неким образом защищены или, ну, хоть в какой-то степени защищены, ну, своей вот общинной организацией на случай, если сильно переменится ситуация в стране. Ну, какая-то часть еврейства запаслась вторым гражданством и билетами, так сказать, на самолет, и она понимает, что вот если дело станет плохо, то их здесь не будет, или они, по крайней мере, думают, что их не будет. Вот. Есть значительная часть такого как бы высоко ассимилированного, не ассоциированного с так называемой еврейской жизнью, не тесно ассоциированного с еврейской жизнью населения. Вот мне кажется, что оно не имеет никаких социальных инструментов на случай перехода страны в другой режим отношения к евреям. Никаких специальных социальных инструментов защиты. Эти люди, в общем, ничем не объединены, кроме, так сказать, сознания, что они там, у них еврейские фамилии или еще что-то в этом роде. Эти люди не... Ну, в общем, они хорошо и комфортно живут сейчас и не знают, как жить, когда станет некомфортно. Вот мне кажется, что к этому моменту стоит привлечь наше общее внимание. А в целом, значит, ну, пока я не хочу быть алармистом. Я говорю о том, что такая возможность есть. Я не хочу сказать, что фаза вот этого благоприятного для евреев состояния кончается. Я этого не говорю. Я этого не думаю. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Jonathan Boyd, who is the Executive Director of JPR, the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, an independent London-based research center and think tank that provides data and policy insight on contemporary Jewish issues for organizations working to support Jewish life in the UK and across Europe. He holds a doctorate in education from the University of Nottingham in the UK and a BA and MA in modern Jewish history from the University College London. He was formerly a Jerusalem Fellow at the Mandel Institute in Israel and has held professional positions in research and policy at the JDC International Center for Community Development in London and Paris, the Jewish Agency for Israel in London and New York, and the UK-based United Jewish Israel Appeal and the Holocaust Education Trust. He's a columnist for the Jewish Chronicle, and his writings have been published in various newspapers, publications, and journals. He's a specialist in contemporary Jewry. He's also a board member of the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry and the Journal for the Study of Anti-Semitism. His current work, importantly, focuses on anti-Semitism in Europe, European Jewish demography and sociology, Jewish education, and Jewish peoplehood. And he currently serves as the project director for the 2018 European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights study of Jewish perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism in 13 EU member states, which is being conducted by JPR in partnership with the global polling agency Ipsos. He also oversees management of the European Jewish Research Archive, an open access research conducted for about European Jews since 1990, and is working to establish a new European Jewish demography unit within JPR, which will generate up-to-date demographic statistics across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Ilya. Thank you to the Genesis Philanthropy Group for bringing me here to Moscow. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. And let me also start by just by saying that the work that the Levada Center has done, and I'm going to focus specifically on the quantitative study, the work that it's done is actually very important, and both, I think, the academics there and the sponsors of the work are to be commended, because to examine Jewish people's perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism in a robust and scientific way is complex for lots of methodological reasons, and the researchers and the sponsors are to be congratulated for their work. Second, I would say that the fact that the research team chose very deliberately to replicate an existing study, and specifically the study that I've been working on with the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, the fact that they chose to replicate that is very important, because the notion of replication in quantitative social research is very important. It allows comparisons to be drawn if it's done well, and actually a lot of this work, I think, allows us to draw some important comparisons. With all of that said, I want to insert a very strong degree of caution about how some of the findings are read, and particularly how some of the comparisons between the situation in Russia and the situation in the European Union are understood. Because on the face of it, the Levada Center report appears on several occasions to indicate that levels of anti-Semitism in Russia are considerably lower or better than they are in the European Union. And there are several examples of this. This is one. The question here is, in your opinion, how grave are the following issues for your country at the moment? And the proportions shown are for the people who are saying it's very grave, or it's at least rather grave. And here we're looking at anti-Semitic graffiti, aggression towards Jews in public places, anti-Semitism in the media, anti-Semitism in politics or in cultural life, anti-Semitism online. And the figures here in blue are for the European Union, the results of the FRA 2012 study, and the figures in orange are for the Levada Center's study of Russian Jews. And to cut a very long story short, you can see that the columns for Russia are lower than the average situation in Europe, in the European Union, which suggests that the situation in Russia is considerably better in the perceptions and eyes of Russian Jews compared to European Jews. Here's another example of the same sort of thing. Here the question is, in the last 12 months, have you personally heard or seen or read any anti-Semitic pronouncements online, in day-to-day conversations with friends, in political speeches, at an educational facility, perhaps a university, at cultural events? Again, the figures for the European Union average are in blue, and for Russia are in orange, and again we see the same situation, that the results for Russia are considerably better. Fewer people are saying that they have personally heard, seen or read anti-Semitism of this type. So the emerging question, I think, that comes out of this is this true? Is anti-Semitism worse in the European Union than it is in Russia? In short, do we believe what we're seeing here? And I would say, based on a simple read of at least some of the results, the answer is yes. At several points in the study, the comparisons drawn between Russia and the EU in this report show the same thing. But is it right? Well, let's bear in mind, first of all, that the figures I've shown you up to now are an EU average. The study that the European Union did covered 8 different countries, so here we're looking at an average across 8 different member states. And of course, the EU is comprised of 28 member states, at least for the time being. I'm acutely aware that that's about to drop to 27. But the FRA study covered 8 countries, Belgium, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Latvia, Sweden, and the UK. And the results clearly demonstrate that the situation is very different from one country to another. Just to give a few examples, 11% of British Jews said they thought that anti-Semitism is a very big problem in Britain, 11%. 52% of French Jews said they thought anti-Semitism was a very big problem in France. Another example, 30% of Jews in Germany said they thought anti-Semitism is a big problem in German political life, but 84% of Jews in Hungary said that they thought anti-Semitism was a big problem in Hungarian political life. So we see huge variance from one country to another, and therefore we have to be very cautious, and I want to stress the word very in that sentence, about making sweeping generalizations about the situation in the European Union, because it really varies dramatically from one country to another in many respects. But interestingly, when we start to examine some of the findings for Russia in the Levada Center report against specific countries within the European Union, Russia itself still comes out looking pretty good. with lower scores not simply than France, which came out particularly badly in the FRA survey, but also than the UK, which actually came out pretty well. Here's a demonstration of this. This is the similar chart, well, basically the same chart as I showed you first. The question again is, how grave are the following issues for the country at the moment? And the figures in blue and orange are the ones I just showed you. The blue ones are the EU average, orange is for Russia. But I've also plotted here the percentages for the UK in grey and for France in yellow or orange or whatever colour that is. And you can see the difference between France and the UK, but Russia comes out, again, lower even than the UK on all of these measures, and we see this again and again. So, let's go back to the fundamental question. Is the situation with anti-Semitism in Russia better than even those countries in Europe that came out well in the FRA 2012 study? Well, so at least some of the evidence from this study suggests yes, but to be sure, we need some corroborating evidence from elsewhere. And it's important to understand that this study by Levada is based on a particular way of investigating anti-Semitism, namely through the lens of asking Jews what they perceive, what they feel, their perspective on it. But there are, of course, lots of other methods. And one very common one, which I know Levada has also been involved in doing, explores non-Jewish people's attitudes towards Jews, or indeed towards Israel. And to focus on perhaps the most expansive example of this work, which was, I would say, the ADL's Global 100 study in 2014, a study which is problematic in many respects, but incredibly useful in many others, we find a different picture. So what ADL did was they looked at non-Jewish people's attitudes towards Jews in 100, actually over 100 different countries, and they gave each country a score. And here is how the countries came out, starting with the worst in the top left-hand corner, which, by the way, is the Palestinian territories. And you read this basically each column down to the best in the bottom right-hand corner. You can see Russia highlighted there in red. So, you know, Russia comes out in this analysis better than some EU countries, for example, Greece, Hungary, and France, although actually some work that Pew has done would suggest that France shouldn't be on that list. But it comes out worse than others. Spain, Austria, Belgium, Germany, Slovenia, Estonia, Portugal, Ireland, and Italy. And indeed a lot worse than still others. For example, the UK, Netherlands, Sweden, not to mention the United States. So when we examine anti-Semitism through this lens, we get a different picture of the situation in Russia. There's another way of measuring anti-Semitism, and that's by investigating patterns of migration and drawing comparisons between different countries in this regard. People migrate for different reasons, but in recent years, Jews have tended to do so for two principal ones, either economic opportunity and/or concern about anti-Semitism, although when we're talking about migration to Israel, a third factor is also involved, of pro-Zionist fervour. Now, the data on Jews and migration are actually pretty patchy, except for Aliyah data, which are collected methodically by the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel. And what do they show? Well, levels of Aliyah from Russia over the course of the last 10 years are significantly higher than from any of the four countries with the largest Jewish populations in the European Union. The four largest ones are France, the UK, Hungary, and Germany. On average, about 9,000 Russian Jews have made Aliyah per annum over the past decade, compared to about 3,000 from France, about 500 or so from the UK, 100 or so from Germany and Hungary. Now, obviously, Jewish population sizes differ across the countries, and that will have a bearing on the actual number of people who make Aliyah per annum. But even when we look at proportions, i.e., how many Jews per 1,000 Jews in the population, in each country's population, have made Aliyah per annum, we find much the same, and you can see them here with the sort of orange dots for each country. So 43 in every 1,000 Jews in Russia have made Aliyah per annum over the course of the last 10 years, compared to 7 per 1,000 in France, 2 per 1,000 in the UK and Hungary, and about 1 per 1,000 in Germany. Now, as I said, the reasons why people make Aliyah are rarely exclusively about anti-Semitism, but the fact that so many more Russian Jews are leaving Russia than other European countries are leaving EU countries certainly tells us something about the conditions under which Jews live in each place. So, in short, the other sort of contextual data challenge some of the more positive and optimistic findings in this study. And for me, this speaks to the importance of examining anti-Semitism from multiple perspectives. A singular approach, and certainly a singular finding, is never sufficient. If we're serious about trying to understand anti-Semitism and ultimately combating anti-Semitism, then we have to measure it in a variety of different ways, thoughtfully, systematically, using multiple social scientific tools and approaches. I want to highlight one other point, if I may, that the Levada report also acknowledges, and that's history. Jews in Europe, particularly Western European countries such as France and the UK, have been through an entirely different historical experience than Jews in Russia, and thus have an entirely different historical consciousness. Western European Jews didn't experience communism. They weren't denied freedom of religion for much of the 20th century. And many didn't experience the Shoah either. I mean, think about the largest two Jewish populations in Europe today, the contemporary Jewish communities of France and the UK, which together, by the way, are home to about 70% of all Jews in the European Union. Jews in the UK were untouched by the Shoah, and much of contemporary French Jewry migrated to France from North Africa after it was all over in the 1960s. Now, Russian Jews, I don't need to tell this audience, experience history very differently. So when Jews in the EU and Jews in the Russia think about anti-Semitism or religious discrimination, and particularly when they're asked about their perceptions of what's happening around them, they have very different reference points. An example from my own experience. I've been fortunate to grow up and live in the UK for much of my life. I was born in the late 1960s. I've had one solitary anti-Semitic encounter, and according to the existing data, I'm far from alone. We've seen this already in the ADL data that I presented. The UK came out in one of the very lowest positions on the list. But in recent years in the UK, we've seen anti-Semitic incident figures rising, and we've also seen members of the main opposition party, led by the far-left ideologue Jeremy Corbyn, accused of anti-Semitism over and over again. So compared to everything I've known throughout my life, everything British Jews have known for decades, things appear to be much worse than they were. But they're much worse than what existed before, which frankly was one of the best situations that Jews have ever had at any time in history, anywhere in the world. Now you contrast this with Russia, and things may appear to be better for Russian Jews than they were, because not so long ago they were living under one of the most oppressive regimes in the world. So we have to be very cautious about how we read data on Jewish people's perceptions and understandings of anti-Semitism, particularly when we're comparing across countries. The fact that one population scores highly and another scores lowly is not enough to draw accurate comparisons. People's perceptions are driven by their experience, and their experiences often differ dramatically. Measuring anti-Semitic incidents, by the way, or people's experiences, is also problematic. The figures that are the ones that are most commonly quoted by the media and by Jewish community leaders about anti-Semitic incidents are actually very problematic, because different definitions of what constitutes an anti-Semitic incident vary from place to place. How one counts incidents in the age of social media, the fact that all of those data are reliant on people coming forward to report incidents in the first place or not, all combine to make those figures very difficult to assess, and certainly very difficult to compare across countries. So even with those figures, the most commonly quoted statistics on anti-Semitism, we're on very shaky ground. And so again, I would stress it's only really through a multi-method approach, looking at different studies conducted in different ways by credible scholars, that we can begin to build a robust and reliable composite picture. And I think that's my core message. If we want to have a serious discussion about anti-Semitism and have access to serious data about it that can be used effectively to combat it, we need to study it in a serious and multifaceted way. using scholars who have genuine social scientific expertise alongside policy experts who together are both steadfastly committed to working together to generate results that provide critical insights for policy purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Our next speaker, please welcome Professor Viktor Petrenko. Professor Petrenko is an associate member of the Russian Academy of Science. He also serves as the head of the Laboratory for Psychology of Communication and Psychosemantics at the Department of Psychology of Moscow State University. And we'll need his presentation, please.
Я не являюсь специалистом по антисемитизму. Я психолог по образованию, преподаю в Московском университете, у меня лаборатория в Академии наук еще. И занимаюсь широкой тематикой, например, моя последняя книжка – это «Методологические пересечения квантовой физики и методологии коллективного бессознательного». У меня работы по политической психологии, по этнопсихологии, по психологии искусства – достаточно широко. И вот я расскажу сейчас о небольшом исследовании, которое просто ради собственного удовольствия сделал. Никто не заказывал. Это, поскольку я еврей по матери, мне было интересна эта тема. Здесь очень обстоятельные исследования Левадовского центра, серьезные, фундаментальные, но я бы согласился с предыдущим коллегой, что некоторую критику вербализации. Вот людям, респондентам задают вопрос, они отвечают. Но кроме, так сказать, осознаваемого, есть мощный пласт и индивидуального личностного бессознательного, и коллективного бессознательного, то, чем занимался Юнг, там, Паули. Вот. И методы, которыми работает психолог, ну, я в частности, они сильно отличаются от социологов, которые, так сказать, большими выборками работают. Но мы норовим немножко пощупать менталитет, то есть и сознание, и бессознательное. Вот в лингвистике есть такое понятие language competence, language performance. Знание языка и владение языком. Маленький ребенок может порождать грамматически правильные фразы, то есть у него есть performance, но нет competence, нет знания грамматики, синтаксиса. Мы же можем всю жизнь изучать иностранный язык, достаточно быть competence, но плохо владеть непосредственно перформанс в выполнении языка. Так вот, те системы порождения речевого высказывания могут не осознаваться самим человеком, они на подсознательном уровне. Вот Джордж Келли, теория личностных конструктов, он вообще был психологом, психотерапевтом. Он разработал систему репертуарных решеток, теорию личностных конструктов, для того, чтобы исследовать, как меняется картина мира человека в ходе психотерапии. Мы значительно расширили и методическую, психологическую сторону, и математический аппарат, и строим так называемые многомерные семантические пространства, отражающие менталитет людей. Вот
Can you revert to the first slide, please?
Ну вот первое исследование. Первое исследование касалось представления о разных национальностях, в том числе евреев, и проводилось, около 1000 респондентов было из 12 различных регионов России. То есть было множество шкал. Кстати, вот мы стараемся не давать формулировки респондентам, по которым они отвечают, а пытаться вытащить из самих респондентов на языке, которым они пользуются. И, кстати, часто используем поговорки, фразеологизмы, фрагменты реального политического дискурса. То есть наш вклад в сам набор шкал минимален. То есть мы берем из жизни. В начале образы государства. Видите, тут шестифакторное семантическое пространство. То есть что такое фактор? Это обобщенные категории. По первым двум факторам, просто забавно получилось, образ Израиля и образ России оказались рядом. Таких 12 картинок, естественно, я не буду все показывать. Другое представление – это наложение семантических пространств на географическую карту. То есть можно смотреть, по каким характеристикам те или иные страны близки, на чем они противостоят, и так далее. Да? Образы различных национальностей. Но наиболее критичными оказались россияне, в смысле русские, по 3 национальностям. Хуже всего отношение к цыганам, там по 3 факторам негативные оценки. После войны с чеченцами еще оставался такой привкус, хотя они самые, выступали самыми агрессивными, но заодно оценивались самыми мужественными. А евреям отказывали по 1 фактору в смелости, но в целом, это было уже 10-летнее исследование, я говорил, что мы по собственному инициативе делали. В целом, отношение к образу еврея достаточно позитивное, за исключением только 1 фактора. А потом мы сделали исследование, собственно, на евреев. Это было всего 18 человек, которые владели языком иврит. И в качестве шкал мы использовали фразеологизмы, взятые из языка иврит, по которым оценивались политические деятели, национальности и такие архетипические деятели, архетипические образы. Например, первые 2 фактора. Как еврейские респонденты оценивали образы политических лидеров, каких-то, архетипических, исторических и конкретной национальности. То есть, кстати, интересно, в плане фразеологизмов иврита. Почти треть фразеологизмов на иврите имеет аналог на русском языке. Но не только на русском. Видно, через Библию во многом перекочевала, так сказать, некоторая ментальность культуры, связанной с христианством. И, кстати, вот использование фразеологизмов позволило вытащить 12 независимых факторов. То есть оценка тех или иных образов оказывается достаточно дифференцирована. То есть когда задаются какие-то вопросы в лоб, там получается 4-5 факторов, по которым оценивается этнический стереотип. Фразеологизмы или какие-то, так сказать, такие метафоры позволяют вытащить гораздо больше. И они менее, так сказать, подвержены социальной желательности. Люди как бы более открыты в своих оценках. Пожалуй, все.
Thank you very much.
Еще вот буквально 2 слова. Очень актуальным, на мой взгляд, интересным является тематика исследования коллективного бессознательного. Вот как бы опыт предыдущих поколений влияет на твою психику. Вот когда мы работали с гипнозом и работаем с тематикой бессознательного, как бы можно вытащить не только какие-то события индивидуального, личного, бессознательного, но и какие-то эмоциональные установки коллективного бессознательного, доставшиеся нам от предков. И, кстати, с возрастом эта проблематика усиливается. Например, я совсем не задумывался в далекой молодости о своем частично еврейском происхождении. С возрастом она становится более актуальным и более задумываешься, и хочется вникать в эту культуру. То есть вот зов предков, он мало изучен, но весьма существенен. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, our next panelist is Professor Sergio Della Pergola. He's the Professor Emeritus of Population Studies at the Hebrew University's Avraham Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry in Israel. Professor Della Pergola is a specialist in demography of world Jewry and has published numerous books and over 200 papers on historical demography, the family, international migration, Jewish identification, and population projections in the diaspora in Israel.
Thank you. Thank you to the Congress. Thanks to Genesis. Thank you, Marina, for bringing me here. Antisemitism, of course, is a widely studied topic, and much has been said about it, but I believe there are still avenues and some little innovations that can be introduced to our topic. And let me start with this. Who said that? The rhetor who says that says, you know that a big crowd it is, how they stick together, how influential they are in informal assemblies. It was customary to send gold to Jerusalem. The Senate forbade the export of gold, but to resist this barbaric superstition was an act of firmness to defy the crowd of Jews for the welfare of the state. I mean, this is not a tirade against George Soros or against Benjamin Netanyahu. Who said that? This was Cicero pro Flacco, the year 59 BCE. And this is to say that the first suggestion I give is to put things in historical perspective and understand that some of the fundamentals define time and define cultures and define economic situations. And this is a very bitter consideration to begin with, but I think it's useful. Now, definitions of anti-Semitism, there are many. I quote here the definition worked by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016, which says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews, rhetorical and physical manifestations. I find this appropriate, a little bland, a little weak. In the continuation, the same document better specifies the contents, and in fact, we all know from experience, but I'd like to stress this because I haven't heard that in this conference so much so far. A little bit, yes, but to my sense, not enough. The fundamentals are excessive economic and political dominance, Shoah denial and minimization, Israel delegitimation. These are the three pillars. And then further dimensions, the Jews' physical recognizability, perhaps a bit less today than in the past, ritual murder, deicide, and more recently, interestingly, a kind of Jewish focus, piety for the integrity of human and animal bodies, circumcision, animal slaughtering. So keeping in mind this, I'd like to advance and building on what some of my colleagues have already said, the question of sources and comparability of different instruments. Here I show how they can be comparable. That is, you can draw interesting information from one if you look at the other. Here I compare two different surveys. One is on the left axis, the Jewish feeling about anti-Semitism in the FRA, the 8 European Union countries, and so you have a scale of intensity. And on the horizontal scale, the Anti-Defamation League survey in the same countries, plus many more. And as you can see, there is a sufficiently high correlation between what non-Jews perceive about Jews and about what Jews perceive about anti-Semitism. The two things go together, and the correlation is sufficiently strong to say that, in fact, in this case, France and Hungary are high on both, and the UK and Sweden are relatively low on both. There is a certain coherence between the inside and the outside. Now, one important thing is the contextualization of our discourse. Jews live as humans in societies, and there are other people. And so, first of all, where do the Jews live? The Jews live today mostly in the English-speaking countries and in Israel. About 85% of the total world Jewish population lives in those two cultural areas, unlike in the past where we had many more Jews in Europe and also, of course, in the Islamic world. Now, how does this make sense with certain basic indicators of development? Jews live today fundamentally in the more developed parts of the world. And so you have here on the horizontal scale an index of development, and on the left scale, an index of the frequency of Jews in the total population. As you can see, the more developed the area, the more Jews relative to total population live there, which is fairly good. This was not the case in the past. And Israel is also a highly developed country, and it stands on the right of the line which marks the more developed society. Now, where anti-Semitism is correlated with development. Development on the lower scale and anti-Semitism on the left scale. These are about 70, 80 countries. And as you can see, the correlation is negative. This is good news. Anti-Semitism is negatively correlated with development, although the correlation is much weaker than the correlation we have seen between population and development. But the final statement on this is what's the relationship between Jews and anti-Semitism. So on the lower scale, the frequency of Jews. On the left scale, the frequency of anti-Semitism. And here I have good news. The more Jews, the less anti-Semitism. Contrary to the kind of normal stereotype, it is the Jews who bring anti-Semitism with them because they are too many, a noisy crowd, as Cicero said. So this is a first important contextualization of what we are saying. The situation apparently, from the point of view of socio-demographics and geography, is apparently good because Jews live in areas that are less virulent and less infected. Second point is how anti-Semitism interacts with other components of Jewish identity, because anti-Semitism, as we know, is external, but it is also inside of our minds. We see it, we perceive it. And with a method which, to some extent, reminds what Professor Petrenko indicated before, I will not go into the technicalities. What we need to do is to try to partition the total conceptual space of a certain topic. And here the topic is Jewish identity. Again, without entering into the statistical technicalities, we find a way to calculate the correlations and then to see the distance between the different topics. And we find that Jewish identity can be operationalized into 7 to 8 main domains: the family, rituals, philanthropy, education, ethical, culture, peoplehood, and importantly, proximity to Israel and the fight against anti-Semitism and the concern about Holocaust denial and the memory of Holocaust. Now, what I retain from this, and this is the FRA study of 2012 in 8 countries, the average of the data, is the interesting proximity that exists in the minds, in the latent perception of thousands of Jews, the proximity between the domain of Israel and the domain of Holocaust. Let's keep this in mind. We now move to the United States. We have the Pew study. And interestingly, the configuration of the perception of Jewish identity is identical, or nearly identical to that of Europe. And again, Holocaust and Israel are 2 proximate domains. Family and ritual and other aspects are important, but they are not so much correlated. And finally, a study in Latin America based on a big sample of Jewish educators. And once again, Israel and the Holocaust are strictly proximate domains, and there are other important domains in defining Jewish identity, including, in this case, a greater centrality of the Meir concept of Jewish peoplehood. So we have acquired an interesting notion, and it is the proximity of these 2 variables. And now we go to the outside. Perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism. First of all, let us note that according to the type of indicator that you present, you have a totally different picture. And this is very intriguing, but also very dangerous, because people will be able to instrumentalize the statistics and showing it is very high or very low according to what question was asked. For example, and these are, again, the FRA data, the perception of increasing anti-Semitism in the last 5 years was across Europe 76% who said it has increased, ranging from a low and high according to the countries, and also feeling that the Israeli-Arab conflict impacts on your own security, bringing together again different elements of the equation, is very high. So you can say we have a very diffused and very dangerous situation in these countries. On the other hand, if you go to the bottom of the table, suffered physical violence during the last year, or even feels discriminated in public services, this is very, very low. So you can say it is a minimal, marginal feature, or it is a very pervasive and important feature. So let's be aware that depending on what indicator you are investigating, you get different results. And the important fact is that analytically we have to distinguish, and we have to search all. We cannot only focus on one, and there are certain surveys that only focus on one aspect. Now I go to the definition of what anti-Semitism is, again in the perception of Jews in the European Union, and here we find that the word anti-Semitism is, I'm sorry to say, totally insufficient. We have to partition the contents space of what anti-Semitism is and decompose it into its different components. And there are here 5 major components that we find. Racism, that is, I don't want to see them. You have the component of foreigners, they don't belong, they have different interests. You have the classic components of the protocols of the elderly of Zion, they dominate the economy and the media, and they're everywhere. And then you have the element of denying the Holocaust, minimizing the Holocaust, and finally delegitimizing Israel, not only criticizing, but saying the Israelis are the new Nazis in the Middle East, and similar expressions. And look at the interesting finding once again, and now in the perception of the outside society, and not only in the perception of the inner Jewish society, the dimension of Holocaust and the dimension of Israel are very close. There is a proximity. Again, I'm talking of answers given by thousands of people, and it is therefore a kind of latent connection that exists in the mind of many. One further important fact that I think is understudied is that anti-Semitism has been explored very much at the cognitive intellectual level, that is saying this and that is anti-Semitism, or at the level of behaviors and experiences. I've been attacked, I know my brother has been insulted, but very little at the level of affective, emotional domains. That is, what does anti-Semitism do to me? Do I feel sad? Do I feel aggressive? Do I feel defensive? Do I feel alone? Do I feel more connected? Incidentally, of course, the tragedy in Pittsburgh gives us an interesting ethnographic observation of what happens in those circumstances. And in fact, you see the different emotional, affective responses which are integrally a part of our subject matter. So there is a part which has not been investigated. And I give you proof. Now, this is again based on the FRA study of 2012. A partition of the space of many questions, all related in one way or another to anti-Semitism. And you find in the bottom right part all sorts of variables. Each point is a variable. And regardless of the percentages, ignore the percentages. We are interested in contents. So you have the cognitive aspects, anti-Semitism is this and that, or I have heard that this and that is relevant. And then you move to the left part, and you have increasingly questions that relate to behaviors and to experiences. This occurred to you, were you discriminated, were you attacked, do you know of something that actually happened? Finally, we move to the upper part. There is a domain called sanction. It refers to the reaction of a person when that person hears that circumcisions might be banned in that country, or animal slaughtering, ritual slaughtering might be banned in that country. What would be the reaction? Now, the reaction here is a kind of mixture between a behavior, effect, but also an emotion. And now note the 3 question marks on the upper right side, which I call openly the investigator's nightmare. The investigator realizes he or she did not ask the appropriate questions, and so the questions did not show up. This is the tragedy of us who do social science. We, Jonathan, we have been associated with this, would hope that not in 2018, it's too late, but in 2025, in the next FRA survey, we have those questions, because I do believe that that's the effective portion that we haven't investigated enough. And now let me, once the chair will stop me, I will stop. But in the meanwhile, I have still 1 or 2 points that are significant. Going back to the FRA, where does anti-Semitism come from? Here we are investigating one very specific point, and it is the connection between anti-Semitism and the Middle East conflict, blaming the local Jews for what happens in the Middle East conflict, which is, of course, a well-known part of the broader complex. And here we have different possible answers. Do you feel it comes from the left, from the political left? Do you feel it comes from the political right? Do you feel it comes from extreme Islam? Do you feel it comes from extreme Christians in the countries where you live? And the correlations are perhaps surprising, but they are very clear. The unit of accountancy is a country, and we have 8 countries here, and we find that the strongest connection is between such a contention by the left, the political left. The correlation is the strongest, followed by Muslim. The right is surprisingly weak, and the Christian is totally not significant statistically. And so we learn something which, of course, works differently in the different countries, because, as you see, the dots, each dot is a country, are different, but the statistical correlation is very significant and very interesting. So I see signs of closure, and so I will simply conclude by saying that there are many things that we still have to do and to learn, but perhaps the central point in my presentation so far was that the connection Holocaust-Israel is latent, it is powerful, and therefore I would suggest people who attack Israel unconsciously create a kind of Pavlovian reaction in the minds of many Jews toward Holocaust. Holocaust is unacceptable. You can accept criticism of Israel. People do accept certain times. But the critique of Holocaust is not acceptable. People attack the Holocaust. There is a reaction leaning on the Israel side. And I think this connection explains now very much of the sometimes emotional response of Jews to this or to that event. And I hope this advances us a little bit on the field of understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Finally, last but certainly not least, please join me in welcoming Alan Cooperman. He's the Director of Religion Research at the Nonpartisan Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C., where he leads a staff of more than 20 researchers who conduct surveys, demographic analysis, and other empirical studies of religion's role in public life and societal change around the world. He plays a key role in setting the religions team's research agenda and writing its reports. He has edited and co-authored several of the Center's landmark studies, including its portrait of Jewish Americans in 2013, the U.S. Religious Landscape Survey in 2014, and the analysis of Israel's religiously divided society in 2016. Before joining the Center in 2009, he was a national reporter and editor at The Washington Post, foreign editor of U.S. News and World Report, and a foreign correspondent for U.S. News and World Report and the Associated Press. His overseas reporting included 6 years in Moscow from 1990 to 1996, where he picked up quite a bit of Russian, and 2 years in Jerusalem from 1996 to 1998. Today he lives with his wife and 2 sons in D.C., where he coaches youth ice hockey teams in his spare time. Maybe picked up in Moscow as well, but probably not.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Marina, and thank you all. Thank you all for coming. You know, Marina noted that I have not had the opportunity, though I know these colleagues, to share the podium and to hear them speak about anti-Semitism, and I learned a lot. I have a lot of questions, and I want to try to save some time for you all to explore and for us to talk together. I also want to commend the Levada Center for its work and the people who organized this conference, including Genesis Philanthropy Group, for doing something that makes me feel very comfortable. And that is that the conference is conceived not as a conference only about anti-Semitism, but in its very name and in all of the sessions, it's been dealing with racism and xenophobia more broadly. And I appreciated very much that the Levada Center, in its quantitative study, the parameter study, looked not just at attitudes towards Jews in Russia, but attitudes toward other groups. Because the single largest point that I'm going to try to make in my remarks is that it's a mistake to do otherwise. One might argue that it's a moral mistake to look at anti-Semitism in isolation. I'm going to make, I hope, a data-driven argument that it's a mistake to look only at anti-Semitism, that we ought to look at context and comparative values in order to understand what's going on. So, quick word about the Pew Research Center. We're a non-advocacy research center. We do not take policy positions, and I will try to stick to that today. In the United States, in a study we did in 2013, we asked American Jews a few questions about their experiences and perceptions of anti-Semitism. One of them was a very simple question. How much discrimination do you think there is against Jews in the United States today? Do you think there's a lot, some, not much, or none at all? And 43% of American Jews said they think there is a lot of discrimination against Jews in the United States. So, in contrast to what the Levada Center here found, which is in Russia, евреи не чувствуют антисемитизм. In America, Jews do feel anti-Semitism. 43% say there's a lot. Even in the U.S. general public, that is, American adults as a whole, nearly a quarter of American adults said there's a lot of discrimination against Jews. But while these numbers may seem on the surface to be large, I struggle as a quantitative researcher to understand what these numbers mean. And it's very helpful to me, and I hope it will be to you, to see them in a bit of context. And I apologize that on this slide, the numbers are a little bit small, but I hope that you can read them, and you can see the central point that I want to make, which is that while 43% of U.S. Jews think there's a lot of discrimination against Jews, 56% of U.S. Jews think there's a lot of discrimination against Hispanics. And 2/3 of American Jews think there's a lot of discrimination against blacks. Nearly 3/4 of American Jews think there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims and a lot of discrimination against gays and lesbians in the United States. In other words, while American Jews perceive a fair amount of discrimination against Jews, they perceive much more discrimination against many other groups in American society. Second point to make from this slide, if you'll note the figures for the U.S. general public, and you'll note that on almost every category, the figures for the U.S. general public are lower than the figures for Jews. In other words, Jews, a minority that feels discriminated against, are particularly sensitive to discrimination and are more likely than the U.S. public as a whole to perceive discrimination against just about every group in American society. Asking people about their attitudes toward religious groups and ethnic, by the way, or racial groups is, at least in the United States, a rather sensitive thing. It's rather difficult to do. And there are many ways to do it in which we frankly do not come up with very good data. One slightly hokey, do you know the English word hokey? The one slightly hokey but effective way of doing it is with what we call a feeling thermometer. And we ask people to imagine a thermometer of their feelings from 0 to 100, with 0 being the coldest, most negative feelings, 50 being neutral, and 100 being the warmest, most positive feelings. And then we ask people to put on that thermometer various groups. And we can do this with religious groups, we can do this with racial groups, we can do this with lots of different types of people. Here I'm showing you a slide that shows where the American public as a whole rates on a feeling thermometer various religious groups in America. And you'll notice something very interesting, often surprising to American Jewish audiences, which is that when Americans rate religious groups other than their own, Jews come out as, by and large, the most warmly regarded religious group in American life. And we've done this several times. We've also found, by the way, because it's at least theoretically possible, that the overall rating toward Jews could be very positive, while there could be a very large portion of the American public that rates Jews very negatively. But that's not actually what we find. We actually find that not only are Jews, on average, the most warmly rated group, but that also the share of people who give Jews very, very cold ratings is the lowest of any of these groups. Notice that in the far right-hand column, also highlighted. I'll just tell you incidentally that we did look in these data to see how Jews rated Jews. We were looking for the Jewish Jew haters, the self-hating Jews. We really didn't find any. I sometimes get asked about that. Moving from the United States to, well, one more thing I want to say about this. We've done this a couple of times. Other people have done similar, other organizations, pollsters have done similar thermometer ratings in the United States and found very, very similar results. And the famous Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam was asked about this after he found it in one of his surveys. He also found Jews being the most warmly regarded group, and he was asked why. And his answer was that it's obvious that in America, Jews are widely regarded as successful, smart, and funny. And he attributed that. And we found in our surveys that a self-conception among Jews of having a good sense of humor was a very essential part of what being Jewish means to 42% of American Jews. Now, moving to Europe, we did a survey in 2015-2016 across 18 countries in Central and Eastern Europe, including Russia. And we asked a series of classic social distance questions. We asked people whether they would be willing to accept Jews as citizens of their country, as neighbors, and as family members. These are similar to the questions that the Levada Center asked. And on the whole, 42%, a median across the 18 countries, of 42% of adults in the general public said they'd be willing to accept Jews as family members. This number in and of itself is hard to make sense of. I don't know whether it's high, I don't know whether it's low. The only way I can really make sense of this is to try to put it in some kind of context. Because we asked this question not just about Jews. And when we look at it in context, we see that in fact levels of social acceptance of Jews across Central and Eastern Europe are significantly higher than the levels of social acceptance of Muslims and of Roma, or sometimes called Gypsies. And also at the same time, significantly lower than overall levels of social acceptance of Christians by fellow Christians. Here I'm showing you moving from medians to try to show you country-level results. And here, when we look at the country-level results, and let's focus on the column that shows on the far left, in the dark blue, the share of people in each country who say that they would be willing to accept Jews as family members. That's the innermost dimension of social acceptance that we asked about in the survey. And Russia seems to come out a little bit at the low end, just a little below the median. The median for the region, for these 18 countries, is 42% who say they would accept Jews as family members. Here, Russia looks pretty close to the median, maybe a hair below it. You'll see at the high end, highest levels of acceptance in Central and Eastern Europe, including Greece and the Balkans, is found in places like Croatia and Estonia and Serbia. And the lowest levels of acceptance are found in Armenia and Georgia. I might quickly note that Armenia and Georgia are places that, as you know extremely well, have had pitched conflicts in recent years on national ethnic lines. And that may go some way toward explaining why national identity bound up with religious identity in these countries results perhaps in particularly low levels of expressed social acceptance of Jews. All right, that's Eastern and Central Europe. Now, just yesterday, the Pew Research Center released new data, a new analysis, that includes data not just from Central and Eastern Europe, but also from 16 countries in Western Europe. So a total here, we're looking at 34 countries all across Europe, from the United Kingdom to Russia, Georgia, and Armenia. And when we look at it this way, I've got two columns, and I'm showing you social acceptance, again, as family members of Muslims and of Jews. A few points to make as you kind of digest these figures. And again, I apologize for how small they are. A lot of data I'm trying to squeeze into a slide. I don't know whether you can read the names of the countries, but at the top, the lowest levels of acceptance of both Muslims and Jews in the entire region are found in Armenia, the Czech Republic, Belarus, Lithuania, Georgia, Latvia. The highest levels of acceptance of both Jews and Muslims are found in the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Sweden. Russia here appears even farther toward the low end of acceptance. So even the countries shaded in yellow are the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And in Central and Eastern Europe, Russia was a little bit on the low end. But when we put Western Europe into perspective, it looks like social acceptance of Jews, by comparison with other places, is a bit lower in Russia. This is indeed a bit paradoxical, but this is not based on what Jews have experienced, as the Levada Center and the FRA studies. This is based on the general public's assessment of their degree of acceptance of Jews. But the other thing, and maybe the more important thing I want you to note here, is just how similar the bars are for both Muslims and Jews. The same countries at the top, the same countries at the bottom, There's a little bit more acceptance of Jews than of Muslims. The bars are a little broader for Jews than for Muslims in almost every country, but the pattern is very clear. These two things seem to go hand in hand. One other quick and important point is that we can subdivide people in many different ways. We can look by gender and so on, but here I've taken this slide and I'm showing the attitudes just of younger adults, those under the age of 35, towards Muslims and Jews. And if I can, I'm going to flip quickly back and forth. Can I go backwards? There, that's the previous slide. And this is the younger slide. This is all adults. This is younger adults. This is all adults. This is younger adults. Do you see much difference? There is very little difference. All across Europe, levels of acceptance of Muslims and Jews among younger adults are virtually the same as among older adults. So those who are hoping for change by generation are not seeing it. You can see in these bars that attitudes towards Muslims and Jews tend to go together. This, without doing fancy statistical analysis, is basically showing you the same thing. Here, what we're looking at is the share of people who would accept Jews as family members among those who are also willing to accept Muslims and among those who are not willing to accept Muslims. So, start at the top. In Portugal, 94% of the people who say they'd be willing to accept Muslims in their family would also be willing to accept Jews in their family. Among those who would not be willing to accept Muslims in their family, only 21% would be willing to accept Jews in their family. A difference of 73 percentage points. And all the way along, in virtually every country, we find very large gaps here, making a simple point that acceptance of Jews and Muslims tend to go hand in hand in country after country. I'll give you the specific. I've highlighted Russia. In Russia, 86% of the people who say they'd be willing to accept Muslims in their family would also be willing to accept Jews in their family. Among those who would not be willing to accept Muslims in their family, only 20% would be willing to accept Jews in their family. We've also asked in our surveys a set of stereotype questions. These are very similar, actually, to the questions that the Anti-Defamation League asked in its global survey. These questions, I must admit, give me pause. I was worried about them, but they did work. They worked in a statistical sense in that they yielded data that's cohesive and that makes sense internally and externally. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides. I'm going to move through them pretty quickly, but I want you to see, you can look at the net agree column, which is highlighted in the middle. It's showing the share of people in each country who agree, either completely agree or mostly agree, with the statement, Jews always pursue their own interests and not the interests of the country they live in. And what I want you to notice is the countries that are at the top, Spain, Portugal, Italy, have the highest rates of agreement with this anti-Semitic trope. That is, their highest levels of anti-Semitism on this particular measure. And the countries at the bottom, note Sweden with the lowest levels of assent. I also want you to note, by the way, that in most countries, the majority of people disagree with these questions. Okay? By and large, in Western Europe, most people disagree. But note the questions that are at the top. Now, we also asked another question about Jews. Jews always overstate how much they have suffered. Again, we see the countries at the top of the list, Portugal, Spain, the country at the bottom, Sweden. Now, let's look at a similar question, a stereotype question about Muslims. And the question here is, do you agree or disagree with the statement, in their hearts, Muslims want to impose their religious law on everyone else in our country? And voila, what do we see? The levels of acceptance of this vary from country to country. They aren't exactly the same as what we found on attitudes towards Jews, but the same countries that were high in agreement with these anti-Semitic stereotypical statements are also high in agreement with the anti-Muslim statements, and the countries that are most rejecting of anti-Islamic statements are the most rejecting of anti-Jewish statements. So now, when we put this together and we do the fancy statistical analysis, here using a data set of more than 24,000 interviews conducted randomly all across Western Europe, and we hold constant many different factors, including people's political views, their self-assessments of their economic situation, their levels of education, their friendship group, how many of their friends belong to the same religious group, gender, and so on, and age, and we hold all these things constant, and we look and we try to see what in fact appear to be the strongest correlates, the best predictors or drivers of negative attitudes, not only towards Jews, but towards Muslims and immigrants as a whole, because these attitudes are tightly connected with each other. Now, we're talking about social science here today. Do you all know the definition of social science? The definition of social science is the elaborate demonstration of the obvious by means that are highly obscure. And this graph proves it. This chart proves this definition, because what we see is exactly probably what you would have thought, which is probably the best single predictor of anti-immigrant and anti-religious minority views, that is, anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim views, is right-wing political affiliation, and that is holding everything else constant. But there are a couple surprises here. Oh, I'm sorry, one other thing. We can see down at the bottom of the list, among the most, what you might think of as protective factors, or one of the factors that reduces people's tendency, holding everything else constant, to express negative attitudes towards immigrants and minorities, xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism, is education. Education makes a 15 percentage point difference, holding everything else constant. But there's one other thing that's important, and that is Christian identity in Western Europe. In a highly secular region, whether people are practicing Christians or not, those who self-identify as Christian, are 15 percentage points more likely, holding everything else constant, to express these negative views. Just a couple of other things. You'll note, once again, age makes very little difference. Younger people are not more or less likely by a significant amount. And also importantly, personal economic situation also seems to make very little difference, only about a 5 percentage point difference. And with that, I will turn over the microphone back to Marina and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. So we have a couple of minutes. Are there questions in the audience? Yes, sir.
A question I wanted already to ask yesterday, and that is the attitude towards Jews in Russia. My understanding is that the huge number of Russian Jews who have left Russia and live in Israel and are shown nightly, not today many more, but were shown nightly on Russian TV speaking perfect Russian, had an attitude, had an impact on the Russian view of their Jews, because they perceived these people speaking their own language as nashi. These were our people, and they were speaking our language, and that was an enormous contrast to the old Soviet stereotypes and others. And we all know who've been to Israel that if you don't know Hebrew, but if you know English and Russian, you have never problems in Israel.
Kind of a question am I right?
Does anybody want to comment on that? Sure, Alexei, go ahead.
Shall I speak English?
You can speak Russian, there's a translator.
Да, вопрос был, не влияет ли то, что евреи, уехавшие из СССР и России в Израиль, когда их показывает российское телевидение, представляются россиянам, так сказать, своими, потому что они говорят на таком же русском языке. Ну, я на это отвечаю. Вообще восприятие Израиля в современной России is amazingly good, я бы так сказал. По-русски мне даже трудно назвать. Оно, если вспомнить длинный, долгий период мощной антиизраильской пропаганды, где там вот сионизм приравнивался к фашизму и так далее, то, в общем, то, как Израиль позитивно воспринимается сейчас, выглядит настолько сильным парадоксом, что хочется позаниматься этим посерьезнее, потому что у меня есть такое подозрение, мне трудно его подтвердить результатами исследований, но есть подозрение, что россияне готовы воспринимать Израиль позитивно, но не как еврейское государство. Вот это тут такой как бы блокируется этот элемент. Израиль хорошая страна, ну, Турция тоже хорошая страна, это хорошо поехать, там хорошие пляжи, врачи и тому подобное. И туда без виз можно съездить. Вот, а то, что там были какие-то проблемы, это, так сказать, отодвинуто. С таким Израилем, как сейчас, проблем никаких. Вот, ну, я думаю, что вообще отношения России с Израилем – это сложная тема. В настоящий момент оно очень далеко в позитивной зоне. Но надо думать и о других возможностях.
Thank you. Спасибо. Sergio?
Yeah, I find the idea of the ambassador interesting, but marginal. I don't think Israel can be such a central factor in determining the attitudes of Russians vis-à-vis Jews. It is, indeed, the Minister of Defense in Israel is one of our boys. He did well, and we have the President of the Parliament in Israel is one of our boys. Likewise, Jesus was one of our boys. He did overwhelmingly well.
Thank you very much. Yes, in the back.
Simple question. Can you make available your slides?
Certainly.
Can you make available your slides to those of us who want them?
We'll facilitate that.
Certainly I can, and all the data that I presented are available on the Pew Research Center's website at pewresearch.org.
Thank you.
We'll ask the organizers to share. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. In Russian, excuse me.
Конечно.
Господину Куперману.
Пожалуйста.
Вопрос, the first question. Какая именно дискриминация евреев в Америке? Я не поняла. Эти 40 с чем-то процентов. Второй вопрос. Грузия, я довольно неплохо знаю историю Грузии, и положение евреев в Грузии всегда было идеальным. И для меня совершенно непонятна вот эта реакция, что грузины не приняли бы евреев в свою семью. Это удивительно, как вы это объясняете. Thank you very much.
Я вас понял, но я отвечу на английском, если можно, потому что это мне легче и без ошибок я могу говорить по-английски. What is this anti-Semitism that Americans feel? Well, of course, we did just experience Pittsburgh, and it's not the only terrible such incident, though it is the worst in American history. But I don't think that that's what most Americans have in mind when they speak about anti-Semitism in their own experiences. What we picked up in our survey is that Americans, quite a few American Jews, have felt at one time or another socially snubbed, that is, isolated socially, or called various kinds of names. And indeed, you raise a very interesting point. I think it's really the point that Professor Levinson was making, which is that what Americans consider anti-Semitism, American Jews, and feel as anti-Semitic might not register for Russian Jews. That is, it's a kind of low-level anti-Semitism that if they were in Russia, or we would say this is nothing, but for Americans, it's quite something. You know, and more broadly, I would like to say history is useful here. Professor De La Pergola and Professor Boyd, in their remarks, spoke about the importance of history. And for American Jews, we have experienced in the length of a single lifetime, the length of, say, my father's lifetime, what is arguably the most horrific moment, the biggest tragedy for the Jewish people in 3,000 plus years of Jewish history, in the Holocaust, in which all my relatives in Europe were wiped out and so on. And we've experienced also what is arguably the most philo-Semitic, the most conducive diaspora situation for Jews, also in arguably 3,000 plus years of history. In the space of one lifetime, we've experienced both things. As a result, our heads are spinning. And what is anti-Semitism and how bad is it is something that is really, it's not entirely an objective issue, it's a subjective issue. And Americans may feel it in a very different way than Russians do in a context. And again, that's why I think it's very important to measure these things across countries and to measure attitudes not just towards Jews, but toward other groups, and to try to see it whole and in context. And sorry, lastly, and I apologize for going on so long, but you asked about Georgia and attitudes in Georgia. So one of the things that we pointed out in our study, I'm holding up a copy of it, you can find it on our website, it was called Religious Belief and National Belonging in Central and Eastern Europe, is that attitudes toward religious minorities across Eastern and Central Europe go hand in hand with attitudes toward national identity. What is our nation, and what's the root and what's the core of our national identity? And in Georgia, perhaps in part because of conflicts in recent decades, as in Armenia, again, perhaps because of conflicts that are on ethnic and religious lines, even if they don't involve Jews. Even Jews are not the enemy in these conflicts. These are ethnic, religious conflicts, and these conflicts have heightened the feeling or the importance of ethno-religious identity in national identity, and that is reflected then in attitudes towards Jews. Because I quite agree with you that neither Georgia nor Armenia are places with historically high levels of objectively measured incidents of anti-Semitism. Thank you for your excellent question.
Thank you very much. We only have time for one more question. Oh yes, of course.
I would like to add a comment which is also substantial but also methodological. We have seen in our data, several of us, that there is a tremendous gap between the perception of discrimination and anti-Semitism, which is high, and then the objective measure, what has really happened. Because at the police, at the hospital, in a real estate agency, very, very few Jews say, I have been discriminated. And very few Jews, fortunately, have been attacked, although there have been cases of murder. So the perception and the actual are so different, and this is common to all social research. What is the bridging and what is the part that we have not sufficiently investigated? It is discourse. We need to perform an in-depth analysis of the contents of discourse, and I'm talking of the daily press, I'm talking of the television, I'm talking of political discourse, I'm talking of everything which is spoken and written, and there are techniques that work on contents analysis of words. You have to put the word Jews in the context of the 5 lines that precede and the 5 lines that follow. This is a huge research project that is not yet done, and it is very much on the qualitative. I am a quantitative person, but there are ways of bridging between the qualitative and the quantitative. I think this is the crucial, because it is in the air, you cannot show it really happened, and I say latent perceptions are somewhat imaginary, but they're very real. And so this is something that we miss in research.
Thank you. Jonathan, did you want to comment?
Yeah, just to add on that. So we did a study of non-Jewish attitudes towards Jews and Israel in the United Kingdom, which we published last year, where we actually tried to explore exactly that issue, the distinction between perceptions and experiences, and I guess what Professor Petrenko was talking about, the sort of subconscious collective piece, and tried to do it quantitatively. And what we found was, by studying attitudes towards sort of tropes about Jews or tropes about Israel, we found that the proportion of people in the United Kingdom who hold what could be considered hardcore anti-Semitic views is tiny. It's 2%, maybe 3%. But the prevalence of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel views that exist at some level in society, very low level, they may well exist alongside positive views as well. In terms of anti-Jewish ideas, exist at a level of 30%, and if you include anti-Israel ideas as well, it exists at a level of 56%. So I think what that means is that the likelihood of Jews encountering, in the UK anyway, hardcore anti-Semites is very low. But the likelihood of them encountering, under certain circumstances, anti-Jewish expressions or anti-Israel expressions is much, much higher. And I think that's in a sense what we're seeing at the moment, that these ideas sort of fester, if you like, under the surface, and they don't necessarily come out very often, but they do come out from time to time, particularly, I think, when tensions are high. We've seen, there's plenty of evidence to say when things kick off in Israel and Gaza, we see spikes in anti-Semitic incidents. So there's, I think, an important distinction to draw between sort of hardcore anti-Semitism and, if you like, low light, under the surface, just sort of negative attitudes that exist at a very low level, that rarely come out but nevertheless are there.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this session. I want to thank our panelists for their perspective and their time. Clearly, this conversation needs to continue, both in the context of the research community, but also beyond that, as we strive to protect the future in combating anti-Semitism and xenophobia and racism. If you could stay for one moment, we have an announcement.
Добрый день. Я думаю, что это одно из самых интересных заседаний. Спасибо модератору, спасибо всем участникам. Специфика этого заседания такова, что очень много говорили устно. Для будущей публикации нашего сборника мы просим расширенные тексты ваших статей, тех, кто их предоставил. Объявление у меня следующее, господа. На стойке регистрации участников конференции сейчас находятся проекты декларации на русском и английском языке. Эту декларацию мы будем принимать на нашем последнем заседании, и большая просьба с ними ознакомиться. Для участников конференции, спикеров, мы разослали тексты также на электронные адреса, и будем вам признательны за любые ваши поправки. Сегодня мы примем проект, в течение примерно недели редакционная комиссия будет дорабатывать ваши предложения и замечания. Спасибо и кофе-брейк. Спасибо. Замечательно. Очень рад с вами познакомиться.